Okay, we're going to look now at the consequences, the economic consequences of the purge of the American left after World War II. And they were profound. Let's start with one of the earliest ones. In 1947, a law was passed called the Taft-Hartley Bill, after Senator Taft and Congressperson Hartley. And this was a remarkable piece of legislation. It went after the communists, it went after the socialists, and it went after the labor unions. It basically told labor unions that they couldn't anymore elect democratically their own leaders. For example, it forbade a communist from running for office, winning a majority of the votes, and serving as the leader of a union, which communists had been doing for 20 or more years in the United States without an incident. It became illegal. Wow. But it went much further. It had a remarkable clause which has remained law to this day as I'm speaking. And the clause goes like this. If at a workplace, a factory, an office, a store, there's a union, and let's say half the workers in this place have voted for the union and joined the union and have a union there. And let's say that that union negotiates with the employer and gets a contract. Let's say a wage increase of 10 cents an hour. Under the Taft-Hartley law, then and to this moment, that union must give anything it wins with the employer to all the workers there, whether they're in the union or not, whether they joined the union or not, whether they pay union dues or not, whether when the union, if it thought it had to, called a strike and had workers go out and tell the public about their situation to help pressure the employer to meet them halfway and give them a wage increase. The workers who went on strike and therefore didn't get paid had to give to all the other workers who didn't go on strike, who didn't lose a day's pay, the same benefits they won. The Taft-Hartley law, in effect, created an incentive for workers not to join a union, not to pay the union dues, because they would get whatever the union won, whether they did so or not. That's fundamentally unfair, and you know it, and I know it, and the people then knew it. It was a hammer blow against the labor movement. Wow. This was an attempt to destroy the communists and the unions and the coalition between them. Because, of course, if a communist couldn't be elected, that removed them from leadership of unions. And if more and more people decided not to pay union dues, not to be part of the union, it weakened whatever unions could do. So it was a crazy but effective way to abuse the law in the interest of a purge. But it had the effect of weakening the labor movement. It was the opening gun, and there are many more laws that came afterwards, to a direct assault on the labor movement, which has worked very well, reducing labor membership from about 35% of all workers at the end of World War II to about 10% today. A staggering cutback. Anyone in America today, and there are a few, who talks about an economy with big business on the one hand and big labor on the other is either ignorant or lying in your face. Big business has gotten bigger and richer. Big labor, it's gone. There is no big labor. Hasn't been for years. We are an economy dominated by one side of what used to be a rough balance. And boy, does it show. The next effect, economically, was to get rid of socialists, communists, left-wingers, liberals of all kinds teaching in American schools, public schools, colleges, universities. They, too, were demonized. They were dupes. They were agents, all the words that some of you, the older ones among the audience, remember. And this had an interesting effect. it basically removed from the learning process of most Americans critical ideas about the system you live in. Socialists raised questions about American capitalism. Communists raised questions. They offered alternatives. They made people able to see that capitalism has flaws and capitalism has weaknesses, and that there are people who have struggled with those and come up with better solutions to problems. You know, that's how human progress works. Always has. You identify something in the society that needs fixing, and then you fix it. You come up with a better way of doing it, a better way of thinking about it, a better way of approaching a problem. That's why we don't rub sticks together to make a fire. We've learned something. And that's because people early on said there must be a better way to start a fire than spending all this time rubbing these two damn wet sticks together. Well, if you don't criticize capitalism in school, you prevent people from learning to think critically about their system, and that undercuts progress. It makes you stay with the system you got because you're afraid to think critically. You're afraid to allow a teacher to raise with students the questions of flaws and faults, things that could be done better, ways of approaching questions and solving problems in a different way. All of that was gotten rid of across the board in the United States. Not 100%, you never can do that, but overwhelmingly. And even those professors who were left, who weren't left-wing but were left in their jobs, were afraid to say anything because they saw what happened to their colleagues and they didn't want it to happen to them. But the Purge went even deeper and further. There was that famous case of the Hollywood 10. The government got rid of, and absolutely with the cooperation of the big film studios in Hollywood, of all kinds of progressive, left-wing, socialist, communist, liberal filmmakers, writers, artists, actors, actresses, destroyed their careers to get the message across that Hollywood was not to make movies that make working people heroes. It was to make movies that said our industrial leaders were captains of industry. Kind of funny when you think that at the end of the last century, those same people were called robber barons. Wow. You change a culture. And so whether the movies or the TV shows that came in, or the radio shows, or the schools or the universities or the colleges or the labor movement, wherever the Purge could go, it went, hounding people for their ideas, hounding people for the questions they asked, silencing an entire generation. And of course the predictable happened, and I want to hammer at that. Killing off those leaderships, destroying the education of people in critical ways of thinking was very convenient. It made it possible for the next decades, the 70s, the 60s already, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, to be times of rolling back the New Deal, which we did. We let the minimum wage rot as prices went higher. The minimum wage wasn't adjusted. So the real effect was to reduce it. Government employment stopped dead in its tracks. Even in the crisis of 2008, when we had millions and millions of Americans losing their jobs, no leader of the Republican or Democratic Party even brought up the idea of a government jobs program, even though it had worked so well the last time we had this problem. That's how successful the Purge went. You don't bring up those ideas. They had become taboo. They had become unthinkable, unspeakable, out of the norm. It meant that the people who were critical of America's adventures overseas, when to help big business we went to war or abused other countries or allowed our allies to do unspeakable things, like Saudi Arabia did a few weeks ago. Where were the critics We didn't have them. They were afraid to speak. When poverty went nuts in America over the last 40 years, where were the critics? When the inequality of income in America exploded, where were the critics? They were afraid. They kept their mouths shut. They were afraid to see what was going on, or certainly to speak about it, for fear that they would be subject, sooner or later, to another purge like that horrible one they had lived through or heard from their parents about back in the late 40s and 50s. The impact was to weaken the labor movement, to weaken social criticism, to convert, for example, the Congress of the United States, the political scene, not to a debate between the people who appreciate and like capitalism on the one hand and those who are critical on the other. That'd be a healthy debate. No. None of that. We have people in Republican leadership and Democratic leadership whose job it is to outdo one another in celebrating the system as it is and demonizing critics. They're still doing that because they haven't learned the lesson. It's particularly poignant with the Democrats, who don't understand that by not keeping the other side of the political spectrum in a balance, they were in effect ceding the territory to the other side. It was the part that could call itself American, having demonized the other part. For those of you who weren't alive then, let me tell you, in the 1930s, it went the other way. It was the capitalists who had brought us the Great Depression. It was their bad investments, their corruption, their banking irregularities that had plunged us into this morass of 11, 12 years of depression. They weren't heroes. They were crooks. They were exploiters. They were the robber barons. But the last 40 years has converted them into creative, job-creating entrepreneurs. Nice change of language that reflects the purge of those who were critical. And of course, the end result of that is precisely the Trump administration, even though there were many steps up to it. The costs of economic inequality, the costs of political nightmare, those are some of the prices we're paying now in economic reality because of the politics of destroying the New Deal coalition at the end of World War II. It is a lesson, a testimony to the power of politics to shape our economics. It is also a powerful lesson that when the next crash came in 2008, there was no left. The communists gone, the socialists gone, the labor movement a shadow. There was no pressure, so the government, Bush, Obama, Trump, bails out the big corporations. All they want. And for the rest of us, nothing. No Social Security or equivalent, no unemployment, no public jobs. That's the cost for us of the defeat of the left after World War II.